We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Wadawurrung people, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Hi there, Chris McKenzie here at WorkSafe. Welcome to another episode in the HSR podcast, helping you achieve better health and safety outcomes in your workplace. This series offers advice, guidance and support on a range of topics for health and safety representatives, employers and employees from industry experts and leaders in OH&S. It's all brought to you by WorkSafe, Victoria's occupational health and safety regulator and workers' compensation insurer. Put simply, our job is to reduce workplace harm and improve outcomes for injured workers. We offer education, support and guidance for Victorian workplaces to provide a safe environment and hold employers to account if they fail to do so. But the role of health and safety representatives, or HSRs for short, is so important because WorkSafe simply can't be at every workplace all the time. HSRs provide that crucial link between employers and employees in workplaces across Victoria. So far in this series, we've learned all about the basics of consultation on OH&S matters, the importance of having health and safety representatives in your workplace, and the ins and outs of establishing designated work groups, or DWGs. Make sure to catch up if you've missed any of those first 3 episodes. So now that we know what an HSR is, and that a designated work group needs to be established for them to represent, it's now time to find out how HSRs themselves are elected. And to do that, we're joined by Kelly Harris, WorkSafe's Director of Advisory and Licensing, to tell us more. Welcome, Kelly.
G'day, Chris. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Now, first things first, we've heard a little bit about it before in this series, but what is an HSR?
Well, a HSR is a representative that's been elected by the designated working group members to represent them on health and safety issues and to support them. And from a leader's perspective, we actually find them incredibly helpful and we work really closely with them. I've been in the advisory and licensing area for 5 years and I have always appreciated the support that we get from our HSRs. We meet them regularly, monthly, and we work through issues. They help us identify hazards or potential hazards, and then they help us to work through the issues with both the leadership team and the people in our area.
So we've spoken already in the series about how important consultation is in the workplace and establishing designated work groups, but there are also specific ways an HSR election needs to proceed within our legislation, isn't there, Kelly?
Absolutely. Something that many workplaces struggle with is remembering that members of the designated working group, they need to determine how the election is to be conducted. That is, if one is actually required.
So what do you mean there, Kelly?
Well, if there's only one person who nominates and there is one HSR position, you don't need to run a full election. And elections can be anything from a show of hands through to emails, through to ballot papers and a box. An example of how we do it is our HSRs will email the designated working group and just ask for nominations. And then we use one of our survey tools, or they use one of our survey tools to then run the election.
So what role does an employer have in an HSR election then?
Yeah. Well, it's really up to us to allow and enable the election to take place during work hours. So it may be through providing resources, facilities and assistance that are reasonably necessary to enable it to occur. So once the election is completed, an employer needs to ensure that the list of HSRs and DHSRs for each working group is kept up to date and displayed. And we have support for this, and it's managed at WorkSafe by our safety advisor, who provides HSR movement updates via emails regularly.
Now, who can stand for election for an HSR?
Well, anyone who's a member of a designated working group that's not disqualified, although preferably not a manager, as they can find it hard to represent both employees and employers.
Yeah, that makes sense, Kelly. Tell us about some of the issues that might crop up there.
Recently, we had one of our emerging leaders step into a leadership role who's also a HSR, and we were discussing an issue about leadership that had been raised by the HSRs, and it was incredibly difficult for her because she was basically on both sides of the fence, temporarily in a leadership role, but permanently as a HSR. So I could see that we weren't getting the best outcomes, but it was also incredibly difficult for her.
So who can vote in an election, Kelly?
All members of the designated working group can vote.
And can an employer just appoint an HSR without an election?
No.
And could an employer just appoint an HSR themselves, Kelly, or what happens if no one nominates, for example?
No, they can't. If no one is nominated, it'll stay vacant.
So what happens if a workplace can't reach an agreement on how to hold an election?
Yeah, if a DWG can't determine how an election is to be run in a reasonable time, any member can contact WorkSafe and make a request for an inspector to attend. The inspector can either conduct the election or appoint another person to do so. In this scenario, the inspectors have some specific items that they need to consider, and this can also mean one or more parties are not going to get their way. So the best advice is to work together as a team and try and solve it.
So, Kelly, why is it so important that the DWG gets to decide who represents them?
Well, they need to feel comfortable in approaching and raising their issues with that with the HSR. So if they're electing it, they're obviously, thinking that's a person that can represent them really well. And they also need to have assurance, or I suppose comfort, that HSR is then going to be able to work with leadership or management to start to work towards resolving those issues.
Great. So, Kelly, when does an HSR term end?
Well, when they leave the designated working group, or when their term of office ends. The rest can get a little bit technical.
Thanks, Kelly. That can get quite technical. So let's bring in WorkSafe's Manager of Industry and Representation Support, Anita Ford, to tell us the specifics.
A HSR ceases to hold office when they resign, but that must be in writing, if the DWG is varied, if the majority of the members resolve in writing that the person is no longer suitable to represent them, but that must not be within that first 12 months of being elected, and if a magistrate disqualifies them, that also means that they are ceased to hold a HSR role within the workplace. None of these things is something that's done by WorkSafe.
And Kelly, can an HSR be elected multiple times? Like if their term of office expires, can they nominate again?
Yes, they can, and they can be elected again as long as the appropriate or the proper election process is followed.
So Kelly, just to wrap up, we spoke about it a little bit off the top, but as you've been speaking about how important HSRs are, and you've worked with them quite a lot, if someone's thinking about becoming an HSR or trying to be, what advice would you give them?
I would say to them to put their hand up. It's an incredibly valued and important role in any working group, and they absolutely get the opportunity to work with leadership and start resolving those issues rather than admiring the problem. So, put your hand up. We want you to be part of the group.
Thanks, Kelly. So just to recap some of the main points we just discussed, to stand for an election as an HSR, an employee must be a member of a designated working group and must not be disqualified. DWG members can nominate themselves or another member to stand for an election, but employers cannot appoint HSRs, and that's because employees have the right to decide who will best represent them and their health and safety interests. Employees also determine how the election will be conducted, while the employer's role is to allow and enable those elections to take place. HSR elections should be held after a DWG is established, or when an HSR no longer holds office, or when their term expires. Only the members of the DWG that HSR will represent can vote in that election. Deputy HSRs are elected in the same way, and an employer must ensure that a written list of each HSR and Deputy HSR for each designated working group is prepared and kept up to date. If you'd like some further information on today's topic, you can check out the links in the text below. This has been another episode of the HSR podcast brought to you by WorkSafe, helping achieve better health and safety outcomes in your workplace. Next time, we're going to find out all about the powers health and safety representatives have under Victoria's OH&S laws and regulations, as we're joined by Leica Croft, one of WorkSafe's own HSRs, and our CEO, Colin Radford. Until then, if you have any OH&S issues or concerns or to lodge a case, please contact WorkSafe's advisory service on 1800 136 089. You can also head to the WorkSafe website to subscribe to our monthly newsletter sharing news, events and resources for HSRs. And if you are an HSR in Victoria, WorkSafe has dedicated support officers available whenever you need help. Just email hsro@worksafe.vic.gov.au.
Please note, this information is based on laws applying in Victoria only. It is correct at the time of recording, but is not to be relied upon as legal advice. This episode does not outline all the legal obligations under Victoria's occupational health and safety laws.